I thought to center us back again on our talk, on the topic, and get going, and we won't have to move again.
Hopefully.
I just want to start with the last sentence that I read. I'm not defending Stalin or anyone else. As a researcher and a scholar, I deal with facts and evidence. I agree with Russian historian Yuri Zhukov when he writes, I can honestly tell you that I oppose the rehabilitation of Stalin because I oppose rehabilitations in general. Nothing and no one in history should be rehabilitated, but we must uncover the truth and speak the truth. So I agree with that. Nor do I wish to suggest that if only Stalin had had his way, the manifold problems of building socialism or communism in the Soviet Union would have thereby been solved. In fact, the topic of my research became that of the report that supposedly uncovered crimes of Stalin and Beria. In this book, I isolate 61 revelations, so-called, or accusatory assertions in Khrushchev's speech. I researched each one of them in light of the historical sources. The end result was that in Khrushchev's secret speech, not a single one of these so-called revelations turns out to be true. There is no question here of defending Stalin. Not one of these so-called revelatory assertions in the secret speech can withstand a confrontation with the evidence. A word about the question of belief. No serious researcher has the right to accept or reject any statement as true on the strength of his own convictions or preconceived ideas. Like it or not, in view of the historical research presented in this book, it is impossible to view the history of the Soviet Union in the funhouse mirror of the secret speech any longer. Something about the implications. Russian historian Yuri Zhukov describes the archival situation in Russia in the following terms. With the beginning of perestroika, one of the slogans of which was glasnost, which meant openness, right? The Kremlin archive, formerly closed to researchers, was liquidated. Its holdings began to be relocated in various public archives. This process began but was not completed. Without any publicity or explanation of any kind, in 1996, the most important pivotal materials were again reclassified, hidden away in the archive of the President of the Russian Federation. Soon the reason for this secretive operation became clear. It permitted the resurrection of one of the two old and very shabby myths. And by that myth that's being resurrected, Zhukov means the myth of Stalin the villain. This myth is very familiar to readers of Western and anti-communist historiography. Arch Getty has called the historical research done during the period of the Cold War, products of propaganda. Research which it makes no sense to criticize or to try to correct in its individual parts, but which must be done all over again from the beginning. I agree with Getty, and would add that this tendentious, politically charged, and dishonest research is still being produced today. The rediscovery of Soviet history goes far beyond the critique of Khrushchev's secret speech. Everything that passes not just for common knowledge, but for expert knowledge about the Stalin period is fundamentally false. To paraphrase Weird Al Yankovic, contemporary singer, one of my favorite guys, quote, everything you know about the Stalin period in the Soviet Union is wrong. All of Soviet history needs to be rewritten. A few examples. Collectivization. Solved the eternal problem of recurrent crop failures and famines. Until 1932 to 33, there had been a famine every 2 or 3 years in Russia and the Ukraine. Thanks to collectivization, the famine of 1932-33 was the last one, except for the famine of 46-47, caused by a crop failure and the huge destruction of the war. Right? End of famine. Collectivization also saved Europe from Nazism. Without it, rapid industrialization and a modern Red Army would have been impossible. The Nazis would have conquered the USSR and had its immense natural and human resources to turn upon the Allies. I have spent a great deal of time and effort in studying the question of opposition conspiracies during the 1930s. My Moscow-based colleague Vladimir Bobrov and I have published a number of articles on them. They're on my webpage. Much more is yet to come. The opposition conspiracies alleged in the Moscow trials did exist. The Moscow trial defendants were guilty of at least what they confessed to. In a few cases like that of Nikolai Bukharin, we know that they were guilty. We can prove today that they were guilty of more than what they confessed to. Leon Trotsky did indeed collaborate with the Germans and Japanese on the evidence. Likewise, the Trotsky archives shows that Trotsky lied over and over again to the Dewey Commission hearings. The various Trotsky archives around the world hold documents that show that Trotsky and his son Leon Sedov discussed between themselves what lies they were going to tell to the Dewey Commission and in their writings. Likewise, Trotsky did form a bloc with the Zinovievites, Wrights, and others to assassinate Stalin and other Soviet leaders, as charged in the Moscow trials. On December 1st, 1934, they did succeed in murdering Sergei Kirov in Leningrad. The so-called Great Terror was deliberately caused by Nikolai Yezhov, head of the NKVD, who killed, probably, several 100,000 Soviet citizens in an attempt to sow discontent with the Soviet government and help open the door for a German and or Japanese invasion. The military conspiracies, too, were genuine. The Soviet Union did not invade Poland in 1939. You didn't know that, did you? They didn't. The Moscow-Ribbentrop Pact did not divide up Poland, much less Europe. It enabled Allied victory in World War II. The Nazi propaganda version that the Soviets shot 14,000 or 22,000 or however many Polish prisoners of war at Katyn has been seriously challenged. There is good evidence that the so-called smoking gun documents are forgeries. The only source in English for information about this fascinating historical subject, one in which the evidence is still being uncovered, is my webpage on the subject, which is on my webpage, on my homepage. I also have articles, some shorter, others longer and with fuller documentation, about all of the issues I have just mentioned. Since my friend George explicitly mentioned the allegations that Khrushchev had Sergei Kirov murdered on December 1st, 1934, let me say a few words about this question. I have just finished a book on the Kirov murder and just signed a contract, actually last week, with a publisher in Russia that's going to appear. Khrushchev wished to prove that Stalin had had Kirov killed. This was part of his plan to declare all the defendants of the Moscow trials innocent. He had only just begins to do this in the secret speech of '56, but continued to do much more of this later. Eventually, Khrushchev's top-level commissions found that Stalin did not kill Kirov, but they could not or did not want to contradict Khrushchev's basic historical paradigm. So they concluded that Leonid Nikolaev, who did shoot Kirov and was caught on the spot, was a, quote, lone gunman. Stalin, therefore, must have had everybody else framed. The Khrushchevites declared that all the Moscow trials were frame-ups and all the defendants were innocent. This became the basic story for the Western anti-communists, as well as for Roy Medvedev and the Soviet Khrushchevite anti-communists. Robert Conquest picked it up. Conquest and others eventually returned to the story that Stalin killed Kirov. Conquest and then Amy Knight, another Western anti-communist researchers, wrote books to try to prove this. Gorbachev's men wanted to prove it too. Alexander Yakovlev, Gorbachev's right-hand man, tried hard to encourage Gorbachev's rehabilitation commissions and Politburo researchers to prove that Stalin killed Kirov, but they were unable to do so. Eventually, they too fell back on the Khrushchev-era findings that Nikolaev was a lone gunman, and Stalin framed everybody, like the evil guy they all wanted him to be. This is the position assumed, not proven or even argued, but assumed, by Alla Karelina, the Russian authority on Kirov. She was the curator of the Kirov Museum in Leningrad for many years and published her book in the 1990s and republished it in 2001. In September 2010, just a year ago, Matthew Leno, a professor of Russian history at the University of Rochester here in the States, published an 800-page book in the Yale University Press's series, Annals of Communism. The book is titled The Kirov Murder in Soviet History. Leno has spent the last 10 years writing this book. It is supposed to be the last word on the subject. In it, Leno claims that he has proven the Khrushchev-Gorbachev-Karelina hypothesis that Nikolaev was a lone gunman and that Stalin framed everybody. I have just completed a book-length project that begins with a detailed dissection of Leno's book and goes on to consider all the evidence that Leno never considers, either dismisses or ignores entirely, never even telling his readers that it exists. There is no doubt that Leno is wrong. We have a huge amount of evidence now that proves that the men convicted and executed along with Nikolaev in December 1934 were in fact guilty. More than that, we have a huge amount of evidence that the accused in the Moscow trials, all three of the Moscow trials, were also guilty. Guilty not just of what they confessed to, but also of some crimes to which they did not confess, but which came to light later on. The same is true of the military men convicted in the so-called Tukhachevsky affair. We now possess a huge amount of evidence of their guilt. Their innocence is asserted by every authority in the field, but the evidence tells the story. My colleague Vladimir and I have done much research on this as well. Lino does not mention any of this evidence, undoubtedly because it contradicts his own preconceived idea that Nikolaev was a lone gunman. The point is, this has to be his conclusion. It's preconceived because it is the only conclusion acceptable to mainstream anti-communist historiography. Just like, quote, the Soviets shot all the Polish POWs in cold blood, end quote, is the only version of the Katyn massacre acceptable to mainstream anti-communist historiography. Because Lino and Karelina hide from their readers the evidence that contradicts their conclusions, you can only learn of this evidence if you spend a lot of time, effort, and money identifying, locating, obtaining, and studying it, and that's what I've done. I cite these examples to illustrate how completely fraudulent the canonical history of the Soviet Union has been and remains. And this history is canonical not just for pro-capitalist anti-communists, but unfortunately for almost all on the left as well. The political forces that promoted first a greater role for the market in Soviet society, and then the wholesale return to super-exploitative capitalism in the Soviet Union, are the same ones who demonized Stalin in the Stalin years. They also sponsored the research, or better put, propaganda, that spreads this version of history, which is the mainstream version in Russia as it is elsewhere. The historiography of the Soviet Union has been dominated by propaganda from the beginning, but the propaganda came to predominate during the post-World War II Cold War. During the past decade, I've spent a great deal of time and also money acquiring and studying the documents from the former Soviet archives that have been released since the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. I've concentrated my study on those documents that deal with the Stalin period, and within that period, I've mainly concentrated on the 1930s. I've also studied a great many secondary sources by well-known experts on this period in Russia and the West. All of the most famous voices and controlling influences in Soviet history today are anti-communist ideologues who misuse historical science in the interest of demonizing Stalin and the Stalin period. This is not only a matter of political bias, though there is plenty of that. There is a great deal of deliberate falsification, provable outright lying in works by famous historians of the Soviet Union. I demonstrated in my book that Khrushchev used a number of different methods of prevarication, falsification, and misdirection in his speech. But the most common one of all, 40 out of the 61 so-called revelations, are provable lies. That is, Khrushchev had to know that what he was saying was false. The same thing is true about the works of many of the most famous academic historians of the Soviet Union today, both Western and research and Russian. At some point in every class I teach, I teach literature, right? I don't teach Russian, Soviet history. At some point in every class I teach, I ask the students, quote, what is the most radical word in any language? Commonly, I get a number of answers. Among the most frequent are socialism and communism. Then I say, socialism and communism are good radical words, but my vote is for a different word, evidence. Ask for evidence everywhere and always, and you will be called a communist soon enough. This is nowhere more valid than in the study of the history of the communist movement. Lies predominate, and when you probe for the evidence, things start to get interesting. I am often told, Grover, that's me, I don't find your arguments persuasive. My response goes like this. Persuasion is a form of propaganda or public relations. Persuasion depends, to a great extent, on the mindset of the person you are trying to persuade. Upton Sinclair once wrote, quote, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it.
That's been my experience.
A person with very fixed preconceived ideas cannot be persuaded by any evidence, no matter how good. Likewise, it is difficult, if not impossible, to get a person to look at the evidence in an objective manner, when doing so will force him to confront the possibility that his most cherished prejudices and preconceived ideas are wrong. His peace of mind, the fellowship of his friends, maybe even his job, depends upon his worshiping the common knowledge, the idols of the tribe. But I can tell you this, I make many of my discoveries by following up the footnotes in the works of academic secondary sources, checking to see whether the primary sources cited in those notes really provide evidence for the fact claims or statements that are made. It is very often the case that I discover they don't. The evidence cited does not prove the fact claim made. The Cold War Khrushchevite paradigm has been the prevailing view of the history of the Stalin years. The research that I am reporting on now can contribute, I hope, towards a clearing of the ground, a beginning all over again from the beginning. The truth that finally emerges will also have a great meaning for the great Marxist project of understanding the world in order to change it, of building a classless society of social and economic justice. Thank you.
Yeah.